In the deepest corners of Tamriel, where moonlight fears to tread and whispers carry more weight than steel, there exists a form of magic that scholars dare not name in daylight hours. Shadow magic, the art of bending darkness itself to one's will, of walking between the spaces where light cannot reach, of drawing power from the very absence of illumination that most mortals instinctively fear. Tonight, we delve into the forbidden archives, the hidden texts, and the carefully guarded secrets that reveal how shadow magic has shaped the course of Tamrielic history from the earliest ages to the present day. This is not merely the story of spells and incantations, but of entire civilizations that rose and fell through their mastery or ignorance of the shadows that dance at the edges of reality. What you are about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about magic in the Elder Scrolls universe. The techniques I will reveal have been practiced by assassins who could kill with a gesture, by thieves who could steal the very light from a room, and by scholars who traded portions of their souls for knowledge that exists only in the spaces between thoughts. These are the secrets that the College of Winterhold whispers about in hushed tones, that the Psijic Order guards more jealously than their most precious artifacts, and that even the Daedric princes approach with a mixture of respect and caution. The origins of shadow magic stretch back to the Dawn era, when the boundaries between light and darkness had not yet solidified into the rigid structures that govern modern reality. In those primordial times, when the Aedra and Daedra still walked freely among mortals and the very concept of death remained fluid and uncertain, there existed practitioners who understood that shadow was not merely the absence of light, but a fundamental force in its own right. The earliest recorded mention of organized shadow magic appears in the fragmentary texts discovered within the ruins of the Crystal Tower, written in a dialect of Aldmere so ancient that even the most learned scholars of Alanor struggle to translate its meaning. These texts speak of the Umbil Conclave, a secretive order of Aldmere mages who believed that true magical mastery could only be achieved by embracing the darkness that existed within all things. According to these ancient accounts, the Umbil Conclave viewed conventional magic as fundamentally flawed, limited by its reliance on external sources of power such as magicka drawn from Aetherius or energy borrowed from the Daedric planes. Shadow magic, they claimed, drew its strength from the void spaces that existed between all things, the gaps in reality where neither light nor darkness held dominion. By learning to perceive and manipulate these void spaces, practitioners could achieve effects that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of magical theory. The techniques developed by the Umbil Conclave involved a complete reconceptualization of the relationship between the caster and their environment, where traditional mages sought to impose their will upon reality through the application of structured spells and carefully controlled energy expenditure. Shadow practitioners learned to work with the natural tendency of reality to create empty spaces, to find the cracks and fissures where their influence could take root and spread. The philosophical foundation underlying this approach drew heavily from early Aldmere metaphysical theories about the nature of existence itself. The conclave taught that all of reality consisted of layers, like sheets of parchment stacked upon one another, with each layer representing a different aspect of the cosmic order. Most beings, including conventional mages, existed primarily within a single layer and could only interact with adjacent layers through tremendous effort and specific techniques. Shadow magic, however, operated on the principle that practitioners could learn to exist simultaneously across multiple layers, drawing power from the spaces between them while maintaining awareness of how actions in one layer would affect the others. This multi-layered existence required a fundamental transformation of consciousness that the conclave described as the Umbral Awakening, a process that could take decades to complete and often resulted in permanent changes to the practitioner's relationship with normal reality. The techniques for achieving this awakening involved extensive meditation practices designed to expand awareness beyond the normal boundaries of individual consciousness. Practitioners would spend months in specially constructed chambers where all sources of external light had been eliminated, learning to perceive the subtle gradations of darkness that most beings dismissed as uniform blackness. Through careful observation of these gradations, students began to understand that darkness itself possessed texture, weight, and responsiveness to conscious intention. The training progressed through carefully structured stages, each building upon the insights gained in the previous level. Beginning students learned to sense the movement of shadows cast by objects in normal light, developing an almost supernatural awareness of how darkness flowed and pooled in different environments. Intermediate practitioners developed the ability to manipulate these natural shadows, causing them to move independently of their casting objects or to adopt shapes that bore no relationship to the physical forms that created them. Advanced students of the Conclave learned to create shadows where no light source existed to cast them, drawing darkness directly from the void spaces between layers of reality. These artificially generated shadows possessed properties that distinguished them from natural darkness, exhibiting a density and responsiveness that allowed them to interact with physical objects in ways that conventional shadows could not. Masters of this technique could create shadow constructs capable of manipulating objects, carrying messages across vast distances, or even engaging in combat with living opponents. The most accomplished members of the Umbil Conclave achieved what their texts describe as shadow walking, the ability to step partially outside of normal reality by aligning their consciousness with the void spaces between layers. Shadow walkers could travel vast distances instantaneously by moving through these empty spaces, observe events occurring in distant locations by extending their awareness along shadow pathways, and even exist in multiple places simultaneously by distributing their consciousness across several void spaces. The practice of shadow walking required not only technical mastery of shadow manipulation, but also a profound understanding of the philosophical principles that govern the relationship between consciousness and reality. Practitioners had to maintain perfect awareness of their own identity while simultaneously experiencing existence from multiple perspectives, a mental discipline that few mortals could sustain without losing their sanity or their connection to their original layer of reality. The Umbil Conclave's approach to teaching these advanced techniques emphasized gradual development over rapid advancement, recognizing that the human mind required time to adapt to the altered states of consciousness that shadow magic demanded. Students progressed through a carefully structured curriculum that might span several decades, with each stage designed to prepare them for the psychological challenges of the next level. The social structure of the Conclave reflected their understanding of shadow magic as fundamentally different from conventional magical practice. Rather than organizing themselves into the hierarchical structures favored by most magical institutions, the Conclave operated as a network of interconnected cells, each autonomous but linked to the others through the shadow pathways that their members could access. This decentralized approach allowed the organization to survive persecution and maintain secrecy while ensuring that knowledge and techniques could be shared among practitioners across vast distances. Communication within the Conclave relied heavily on shadow magic techniques, with messages transmitted through manipulated darkness that could only be perceived and interpreted by those who had achieved sufficient mastery of umbral perception. These shadow messages possessed a security that conventional encryption could not match, as they existed primarily within the void spaces between layers of reality and remained invisible to anyone who lacked the specific training necessary to detect them. The Conclave's influence on early Aldmeri society extended far beyond their direct membership, as their techniques found applications in fields ranging from espionage and warfare to architecture and artistic expression. Aldmeri architects learned to incorporate shadow magic principles into their building designs, creating structures that could adapt their internal lighting conditions automatically, or that provided their inhabitants with enhanced privacy through the manipulation of shadow and darkness. Artists and craftsmen developed techniques for working with materials that had been infused with shadow magic, creating sculptures and paintings that appeared different when viewed under various lighting conditions. or that could convey hidden messages visible only to those who knew how to perceive them. These artistic applications of shadow magic became highly prized among the Aldmeri nobility, who valued both their aesthetic qualities and their practical applications for maintaining confidential communications. The military applications of shadow magic proved particularly significant during the conflicts that marked the transition from the Dawn era to the Merethic era. Shadow practitioners serving as scouts and spies could gather intelligence with unprecedented effectiveness, while assassins trained in umbral techniques could eliminate targets without leaving any conventional evidence of their involvement. The psychological impact of facing enemies who could attack from darkness itself proved as valuable as the tactical advantages that shadow magic provided. However, the very power that made shadow magic so effective also contained the seeds of the Umbil Conclave's eventual downfall. The practice of existing simultaneously across multiple layers of reality created practitioners who gradually became disconnected from the concerns and values of normal society. As their consciousness expanded to encompass the void spaces between layers, many Conclave members found themselves losing interest in the political and social affairs that motivated their contemporaries. This disconnection manifested in increasingly erratic behavior among senior practitioners, who would disappear for months or years at a time while exploring the deeper layers of reality accessible through shadow magic. When they returned, if they returned at all, they often brought with them knowledge and perspectives that seemed alien to their former colleagues, speaking of experiences and entities that existed beyond the normal boundaries of Aldmeri understanding. The crisis reached its peak when several of the Conclave's most accomplished shadow walkers began reporting contact with intelligences that existed purely within the void spaces, entities that had never possessed physical form or connection to any single layer of reality. These void entities, as they came to be known, apparently possessed knowledge and capabilities that far exceeded anything achieved by mortal practitioners of shadow magic, and they began offering to share this knowledge with Conclave members who proved worthy of their attention. The temptation to learn from these entities proved irresistible to many practitioners, who began incorporating void entity teachings into their magical practices without fully understanding the implications of such contact. The techniques shared by the void entities were indeed more powerful than anything the Conclave had previously developed, but they came with costs that became apparent only after extensive use. Practitioners who adopted void entity techniques found their connection to normal reality growing increasingly tenuous, with some losing the ability to interact with physical objects or to communicate with beings who existed within single layers of reality. Others reported experiencing time in a non-linear fashion, with past and future events becoming equally present in their consciousness, making it impossible for them to function effectively within the sequential flow of normal existence. The most severely affected practitioners began to fade from normal reality entirely, becoming visible only as vague shadows that could be perceived under specific lighting conditions. These faded practitioners retained some ability to communicate with their former colleagues, but their messages often consisted of warnings about the dangers of deeper involvement with the void entities and desperate pleas for assistance in returning to normal existence. The warnings of the faded practitioners went largely unheeded by the remaining members of the Umbil Conclave, who had become too deeply invested in their pursuit of ultimate shadow mastery to abandon the path they had chosen. The void entities had promised knowledge that would allow them to transcend the limitations of mortal existence entirely, to become beings of pure shadow who could manipulate reality at will, without being constrained by the physical laws that governed conventional magic. The final collapse of the Umbil Conclave came during what their fragmentary records describe as the Great Dissolution, an event that occurred sometime in the late Dawn era, when the boundary between the void spaces and normal reality became dangerously unstable. The exact details of what transpired remain unclear, as the surviving accounts were written by practitioners whose perception of linear time had been severely compromised by their exposure to void entity influence. What can be determined from these confused and often contradictory records is that several of the Conclave's most powerful shadow walkers attempted to perform a collective ritual designed to merge their consciousness permanently with the void spaces, thereby achieving the ultimate goal of their magical practice. The ritual appears to have involved the simultaneous manipulation of shadow pathways across multiple layers of reality, creating a complex network of interconnected void spaces that would serve as a permanent bridge between normal existence and the realm of the void entities. The ritual began successfully, with participants reporting unprecedented levels of power and awareness as their consciousness expanded to encompass vast networks of shadow pathways. However, the stability of these expanded networks proved impossible to maintain once they reached a certain level of complexity. The interconnected void spaces began to collapse in upon themselves, creating what the records describe as cascade failures that propagated throughout the entire shadow network that the Conclave had spent centuries developing. The collapse of the shadow network had catastrophic consequences, not only for the Conclave members directly involved in the ritual, but for anyone who had ever learned to access the void spaces through their techniques. Practitioners across the Ebonmere territories found themselves suddenly cut off from the shadow pathways they had relied upon, while others experienced violent feedback effects that left them permanently damaged or transformed in ways that made normal existence impossible. The most severely affected individuals simply vanished, leaving behind only faint impressions in the shadows, cast by objects they had frequently handled. These shadow impressions retained some semblance of consciousness and could occasionally communicate with living beings through manipulation of darkness and light, but they lacked the substance necessary to affect the physical world directly. The phenomenon became known among surviving mages as the Shadow Echo, and locations where powerful shadow practitioners had lived or worked often remained haunted by these impressions for centuries afterward. In the immediate aftermath of the Great Dissolution, knowledge of shadow magic became heavily restricted throughout Ebonmere society. The surviving members of the Umbil Conclave were either dead, transformed beyond recognition, or had fled to remote locations where they could attempt to rebuild their understanding of shadow manipulation without risking another catastrophic failure. The techniques they had developed were declared forbidden by the emerging magical institutions of the time, and possession of Umbil Conclave texts became punishable by exile or worse. However, the complete elimination of shadow magic proved impossible, as the fundamental principles underlying its practice were too deeply embedded in the nature of reality itself to be permanently suppressed. Individual practitioners continued to discover methods for manipulating darkness and shadow through independent experimentation, while fragments of conclave knowledge survived in hidden archives and secret traditions passed down through carefully selected students. The rediscovery of organized shadow magic occurred during the early First Era, when the expanding Nordic settlements began encountering ruins that contained preserved examples of Umbil Conclave architecture and artifacts. Nordic mages, lacking the cultural taboos that prevented Ebonmere scholars from investigating these discoveries, began experimenting with the shadow manipulation techniques they found described in the ancient texts. The Nordic approach to shadow magic differed significantly from the philosophical framework developed by the Umbil Conclave, where the Ebonmere practitioners had sought to transcend normal reality through expanded consciousness and multi-layered existence. The Nords viewed shadow magic primarily as a practical tool that could be used to achieve specific objectives without requiring fundamental changes to the practitioner's relationship with reality. This more pragmatic approach led to the development of shadow magic techniques that were less powerful than those achieved by the Umbil Conclave at its height, but also much safer to practice. Nordic shadow practitioners learned to work with existing shadows rather than attempting to create new void spaces, developing methods for enhancing natural darkness without risking the cascade failures that had destroyed their predecessors. The Nordic techniques focused heavily on stealth and concealment applications, which aligned well with their cultural emphasis on practical skills and direct problem solving. Warriors learned to use shadow magic to enhance their ability to move unseen through enemy territory, while hunters developed techniques for tracking prey through the manipulation of shadows cast by animal movements. These applications required far less theoretical knowledge than the Umbil Conclave's methods, making shadow magic accessible to practitioners who lacked extensive philosophical training. The most significant Nordic contribution to shadow magic theory was the development of what they termed bounded shadow techniques, methods for limiting the scope and intensity of shadow manipulation to prevent the kind of uncontrolled expansion that had led to the Great Dissolution. These bounded techniques involve creating specific constraints within the magical working itself, establishing automatic cutoff points that would terminate the spell if it began to exceed safe parameters. The bounded approach proved so effective that it was eventually adopted by practitioners from other cultures who had independently rediscovered shadow magic principles. By the middle of the First Era, a loose network of shadow magic practitioners had emerged across northern Tamriel, sharing techniques and theories while maintaining the secrecy necessary to avoid persecution from conventional magical authorities. This network operated through a system of coded communications and carefully arranged meetings, with practitioners identifying each other through subtle manipulations of shadow and light that would be invisible to untrained observers. The development of these recognition signals allowed for the gradual accumulation of knowledge and the refinement of techniques through collaborative research, while maintaining the security necessary to protect individual practitioners from discovery. The network's influence extended beyond the direct practice of shadow magic to encompass related fields such as illusion magic and enchantment. Practitioners discovered that their understanding of how consciousness could be distributed across multiple layers of reality provided valuable insights into the mechanisms underlying illusion spells, while their experience with void spaces offered new approaches to creating enchanted items that could store and manipulate magical energy in novel ways. The collaboration between shadow practitioners and conventional mages remained limited due to the continued stigma associated with shadow magic, but occasional exchanges of knowledge did occur through intermediaries who could translate between the different theoretical frameworks used by each tradition. These exchanges proved mutually beneficial, with conventional mages gaining access to new perspectives on the nature of magical energy, while shadow practitioners learned more stable methods for channeling and controlling magical forces. The most significant development during this period was the emergence of hybrid techniques that combined shadow magic principles with conventional spellcasting methods. These hybrid approaches allowed practitioners to achieve effects that neither tradition could accomplish independently, creating new possibilities for magical research and application that would influence the development of magical theory for centuries to come. The establishment of formal magical institutions during the later First Era created new challenges for shadow magic practitioners, as these institutions actively sought to catalogue and regulate all forms of magical practice within their territories. The secretive nature of shadow magic made it particularly suspect to institutional authorities, who viewed any form of magical practice that could not be easily monitored and controlled as a potential threat to social stability. The response of the shadow magic network to institutional pressure varied significantly across different regions. In some areas, practitioners chose to abandon their studies entirely rather than risk persecution, while in others, they went deeper underground, developing even more sophisticated methods for concealing their activities from official scrutiny. A few practitioners attempted to work within the institutional framework, presenting sanitized versions of shadow magic theory that emphasized its practical applications while concealing its more controversial philosophical implications. The most successful of these institutional infiltrators was a Nord scholar named Valdris the Shadewalker, who managed to secure a position as a researcher at the newly established College of Winterhold in the late First Era. Valdris had spent decades studying the surviving texts of the Umbil Conclave and had developed a theoretical framework that presented shadow magic as a specialized branch of illusion magic rather than a fundamentally different magical discipline. Through careful manipulation of academic terminology and selective presentation of evidence, Valdris convinced his colleagues that what they termed umbral manipulation was simply an advanced application of conventional illusion techniques combined with sophisticated understanding of light and darkness. This reframing allowed him to conduct shadow magic research under the guise of legitimate academic inquiry while avoiding the suspicion that would have attached to more explicitly forbidden practices. Valdris established what he called the Department of Optical Phenomena, ostensibly dedicated to studying the magical properties of light and shadow for practical applications in architecture and military engineering. The department's official research focused on developing improved methods for creating magical illumination and for detecting concealed magical auras, projects that had clear practical value and attracted support from both academic and governmental sources. Beneath this legitimate research program, however, Valdris and a carefully selected group of advanced students pursued the true study of shadow magic. The department's laboratories were designed with hidden chambers accessible only through shadow walking techniques, while the official research provided convenient cover for experiments that would have been impossible to conduct openly. The work conducted by Valdris and his hidden students represented a significant advancement in shadow magic theory, building upon the Nordic-bounded techniques while incorporating insights drawn from conventional magical research. They developed methods for precisely measuring the density and responsiveness of artificially created shadows, established mathematical formulas for predicting the stability of void space manipulations, and created standardized training protocols that reduced the risks associated with learning advanced shadow techniques. Perhaps most importantly, they solved the fundamental problem that had led to the Great Dissolution by developing what they termed cascading failure prevention protocols. These protocols involved creating multiple independent constraint systems within any shadow magic working, ensuring that if one system failed, the others would automatically engage to prevent uncontrolled expansion or collapse. The mathematical foundation underlying these protocols drew heavily from advances in magical theory that had occurred since the time of the Umbil Conclave, particularly in the field of what modern scholars would recognize as magical engineering. By applying quantitative analysis to shadow magic phenomena, Valdris and his team were able to identify the specific conditions that led to cascade failures and develop countermeasures that could be implemented automatically within the magical working itself. The success of these safety protocols allowed for the development of shadow magic techniques that approach the power levels achieved by the Umbil Conclave, while maintaining the stability and controllability that had characterized the Nordic-bounded approaches. Advanced practitioners could once again achieve multi-layered consciousness and limited shadow-walking capabilities without risking the catastrophic disconnection from reality that had destroyed their predecessors. The Department of Optical Phenomena operated successfully for nearly 2 centuries, training dozens of shadow magic practitioners and advancing the theoretical understanding of umbral manipulation far beyond what had been achieved in previous eras. The department's official research also produced genuinely valuable contributions to conventional magical practice, including improved methods for detecting concealed magical enchantments and techniques for creating persistent magical illumination that required minimal ongoing energy expenditure. The downfall of Valdris's hidden program came not through external discovery, but through internal conflict among the practitioners themselves. As their understanding of shadow magic advanced and their capabilities grew, philosophical differences emerged regarding the appropriate use of their knowledge and the extent to which they should remain hidden from the broader magical community. A faction led by Valdris himself advocated for continued secrecy and gradual expansion of their research program, arguing that premature revelation of their work would inevitably lead to persecution and the loss of centuries of accumulated knowledge. They pointed to the fate of the Umbil Conclave as evidence that shadow magic practitioners could not survive open conflict with conventional magical institutions, and that their only hope for long-term survival lay in maintaining their hidden status while slowly building influence within existing power structures. The opposing faction, led by Valdris's most accomplished student, a Dunmer researcher named Dralsi Nethys, argued that their improved safety protocols had eliminated the primary dangers that had justified keeping shadow magic secret. They believed that the time had come to reveal their discoveries to the broader magical community and to establish shadow magic as a legitimate field of study alongside the other recognized magical disciplines. Dralsi's faction contended that continued secrecy actually increased the risks facing shadow magic practitioners by preventing the kind of open collaboration and peer review that characterized other fields of magical research. They argued that many of the problems that had plagued earlier shadow magic practitioners could have been avoided if their work had been subject to scrutiny from colleagues with different perspectives and expertise. The conflict between these factions intensified as both sides began recruiting supporters from among the department's students and from shadow magic practitioners in other locations. The debate extended beyond questions of secrecy to encompass fundamental disagreements about the nature and purpose of shadow magic itself, with each faction developing increasingly divergent approaches to research and practice. Valdris's faction emphasized the transcendent aspects of shadow magic, viewing it as a path toward expanded consciousness and deeper understanding of the fundamental nature of reality. They continued to pursue the multi-layered existence techniques developed by the Umbil Conclave, albeit with improved safety measures, and they maintained that the ultimate goal of shadow magic should be the achievement of perspective that transcended normal mortal limitations. Dralsi's faction took a more pragmatic approach, focusing on the practical applications of shadow magic for solving immediate problems and improving quality of life for ordinary people. They developed techniques for using shadow manipulation in healing, agriculture, and craftsmanship, arguing that shadow magic's true value lay in its potential to benefit society as a whole rather than in providing transcendent experiences for a select few practitioners. These philosophical differences eventually led to open hostility between the factions, with each side viewing the other's approach as fundamentally misguided and potentially dangerous. The conflict reached its climax when Dralsi's faction attempted to publish a comprehensive treatise on shadow magic theory that would have revealed the existence of their hidden research program to the entire academic community. Valdris and his supporters moved to prevent this publication through sabotage of Dralsi's research materials and intimidation of potential publishers. Their actions escalated the conflict beyond academic disagreement into something approaching warfare, with both factions using their shadow magic capabilities to conduct covert operations against each other. The destructive nature of this internal conflict eventually attracted the attention of the College of Winterhold's administration, who launched an investigation into the suspicious activities occurring within the Department of Optical Phenomena. The investigation quickly uncovered evidence of the hidden shadow magic research program, leading to the immediate dissolution of the department and the arrest of its senior members. Valdris himself managed to escape through shadow walking before he could be apprehended, but most of his colleagues were captured and subjected to intensive interrogation regarding their activities. The revelation of organized shadow magic research within one of Tamriel's most prestigious magical institutions created a scandal that reverberated throughout the academic community and led to increased scrutiny of magical research programs across the continent. The aftermath of what became known as the Winterhold Shadow Incident marked the beginning of a new era of persecution for shadow magic practitioners. Magical institutions throughout Tamriel implemented strict protocols for detecting unauthorized research and established specialized enforcement units tasked with identifying and eliminating hidden shadow magic practitioners. The surviving members of both Valdris's and Dralsi's factions were forced to abandon their research and flee to remote locations where they could avoid the systematic hunt that followed the incident. Many practitioners chose to abandon shadow magic entirely, rather than risk the severe punishments that awaited those who were captured, while others went deeper underground than ever before. The knowledge and techniques that had been developed during the 2 centuries of hidden research at Winterhold were largely lost as practitioners destroyed their research materials to avoid providing evidence that could be used against them. The mathematical frameworks and safety protocols that had represented such significant advances in shadow magic theory survived only in the memories of scattered individuals who lacked the resources and security necessary to continue their development. However, the complete elimination of shadow magic once again proved impossible. The fundamental appeal of techniques that could provide access to capabilities unavailable through conventional magic ensured that new practitioners would continue to emerge despite the risks involved. The harsh persecution that followed the Winterhold incident actually contributed to the development of more sophisticated methods for concealing shadow magic practice, as survival required unprecedented levels of secrecy and security. The practitioners who survived the post-Winterhold purges developed what became known as the cell system, an organizational structure that divided shadow magic practitioners into small, independent groups with minimal contact between cells. Each cell operated autonomously and possessed only limited knowledge of other cells' activities, ensuring that the capture or betrayal of one group could not compromise the entire network. Communication between cells occurred through elaborate systems of coded messages hidden within seemingly innocent commercial or social interactions. Practitioners developed techniques for embedding shadow magic information within conventional magical texts, creating documents that appeared to discuss standard illusion or conjuration theory, but actually contained detailed instructions for shadow manipulation techniques. The cell system proved remarkably resilient against institutional persecution, as its decentralized structure made it nearly impossible for authorities to map the full extent of shadow magic activity, or to predict where new practitioners might emerge. Individual cells could be discovered and eliminated, but the network as a whole continued to function and even expand despite ongoing pressure from magical authorities. The techniques developed during this period of intense persecution emphasized concealment and subtlety over raw power, leading to innovations in shadow magic that focused on achieving significant effects through minimal and virtually undetectable manipulations. Practitioners learned to work with existing shadows and natural darkness in ways that produced results indistinguishable from coincidence or natural phenomena to untrained observers. These subtle techniques found particular favor among practitioners who needed to operate within conventional society while maintaining their shadow magic capabilities. Merchants learned to use shadow manipulation to enhance their ability to detect deception and evaluate the trustworthiness of potential business partners, while craftsmen developed methods for using controlled darkness to improve the precision and quality of their work. The medical applications of shadow magic also advanced significantly during this period, as practitioners discovered that carefully controlled shadow manipulation could enhance the body's natural healing processes and provide pain relief for conditions that proved resistant to conventional magical treatment. These techniques required extensive training to master safely, but they offered therapeutic options that were unavailable through any other means. The most significant development during the persecution era was the emergence of shadow magic traditions that operated entirely independently of the historical knowledge preserved from the Umbil Conclave and its successors. These independent traditions developed their own theoretical frameworks and practical techniques through direct experimentation and observation, often achieving results that paralleled or even exceeded the capabilities of the traditional approaches. The independent traditions proved particularly innovative in developing applications of shadow magic that had not been explored by earlier practitioners. They created techniques for using shadow manipulation in divination and prophecy, methods for enhancing memory and learning through controlled exposure to void spaces, and approaches to artistic expression that incorporated shadow magic as a fundamental element, rather than merely a tool for concealment. The artistic applications of shadow magic during this era of persecution represented perhaps the most unexpected development in the discipline's evolution. Artists working in isolation from the traditional academic frameworks discovered that shadow manipulation could serve as more than simply a method for concealment or practical enhancement. They began to explore the aesthetic possibilities inherent in controlled darkness, developing techniques that transformed shadow itself into a medium for creative expression. The pioneering work in this field came from a group of Dunmer artisans operating in the remote settlements of northern Morrowind, far from the reach of institutional authorities. These craftsmen had initially learned basic shadow techniques for practical purposes, using controlled darkness to enhance the precision of their metalworking and to create unique visual effects in their finished pieces. However, their isolation from formal magical education allowed them to experiment freely with applications that more traditionally trained practitioners might have dismissed as frivolous or dangerous. The breakthrough came when mastersmith Dryloth Sadri discovered that shadows infused with magical energy could be permanently bound to physical objects without requiring ongoing power to maintain their effects. This technique, which Sadri termed shadow forging, involved manipulating the void spaces surrounding a workpiece during the crafting process, creating permanent alterations in how light and darkness interacted with the finished object. Items created through shadow forging displayed properties that seemed to defy conventional understanding of how light behaved around physical matter. Weapons might cast shadows that moved independently of the blade itself, creating disorienting effects that could confuse opponents during combat. Jewelry could project patterns of darkness that shifted and flowed across the wearer's skin, creating decorative effects that changed throughout the day as lighting conditions varied. The most sophisticated examples of shadow forging produced objects that appeared completely different when viewed under various lighting conditions. A sculpture might appear as a simple geometric form in bright light, but reveal intricate detailed scenes when examined in dim illumination or by candlelight. These transformative pieces required extraordinary skill to create, as the artist had to visualize and plan for multiple different appearances while working with the complex interactions between shadow magic and conventional craftsmanship. The techniques developed by the Dunmer artisans spread gradually through underground networks to practitioners in other regions, leading to the emergence of distinct regional styles of shadow art. Redguard artists in Hammerfell developed methods for incorporating shadow manipulation into textile work, creating fabrics that displayed different patterns and colors depending on the angle and intensity of illumination. These shadow textiles became highly prized among those wealthy enough to afford them and discreet enough to avoid attracting unwanted attention from authorities. Nordic woodcarvers adapted shadow forging techniques to their traditional medium, creating sculptures and architectural elements that seemed to breathe with life as shadows flowed across their surfaces. The interplay between the natural grain of the wood and the artificially manipulated darkness created effects of remarkable beauty and complexity, turning simple furniture and decorative objects into works of art that continue to reveal new details years after their creation. The most ambitious artistic applications of shadow magic emerged among imperial artists working in the underground communities that had developed in the abandoned sections of various cities throughout Cyrodiil. These artists had access to larger spaces and more diverse materials than their counterparts in other regions, allowing them to experiment with shadow installations that transformed entire rooms or buildings into immersive artistic experiences. The creation of these shadow installations required unprecedented cooperation between multiple practitioners, as the manipulation of darkness across large spaces demanded coordinated effort and shared understanding of complex theoretical principles. Teams of artists would spend months planning installations that would unfold over time, with different elements becoming visible or hidden as lighting conditions changed throughout the day or as viewers moved through the space. The most famous of these installations, known only through carefully coded descriptions preserved in hidden archives, was reportedly created in a series of underground chambers beneath the imperial city during the late Second Era. The installation, which its creators called the Void Symphony, allegedly transformed the chambers into a representation of the void spaces between layers of reality, allowing visitors to experience something approximating the multi-layered consciousness that advanced shadow practitioners achieved through decades of training. Visitors to the Void Symphony reported experiencing profound alterations in their perception of time and space, with some claiming to have witnessed events from their own past and future simultaneously. The installation incorporated not only visual elements, but also manipulations of sound and even temperature, creating a total sensory environment that challenged visitors' understanding of the nature of reality itself. The creation of such ambitious works required artists to push the boundaries of shadow magic theory far beyond what had been achieved by purely practical applications. They developed new mathematical frameworks for predicting how complex shadow manipulations would interact with each other over extended periods, and they created innovative training methods that allowed multiple practitioners to coordinate their efforts with unprecedented precision. However, the very ambition that made these artistic applications so remarkable also made them extremely dangerous to their creators and audiences alike. The extensive manipulation of void spaces required for large-scale installations created risks that even the improved safety protocols developed at Winterhold could not fully mitigate. Several installations reportedly resulted in permanent alterations to the spaces where they were created, with some chambers becoming permanently unstable and dangerous to enter. The most tragic incident occurred when an installation in Skingrad collapsed during a viewing, apparently trapping several visitors within void spaces from which they could not return. The survivors reported that the trapped individuals remained visible as shadow impressions for several days after the collapse, desperately attempting to communicate their situation before finally fading from perception entirely. This incident led to increased caution among artistic practitioners and the development of more conservative approaches to large-scale shadow manipulation. Despite these risks, the artistic exploration of shadow magic continued to advance throughout the Second Era, driven by practitioners who viewed their work as essential to understanding the full potential of umbral manipulation. They argued that purely practical applications, while safer and more easily concealed, failed to explore the deeper implications of shadow magic for consciousness and perception. Only through artistic experimentation, they claimed, could practitioners develop the insights necessary to advance shadow magic theory beyond its current limitations. The philosophical framework underlying this artistic approach drew heavily from ancient Ebonmere theories about the relationship between creative expression and magical understanding. The artists maintained that true mastery of any magical discipline required not just technical competence, but also intuitive appreciation for the aesthetic principles that governed the interaction between consciousness and magical energy. Shadow magic, they argued, was particularly suited to artistic exploration because its fundamental nature involved the manipulation of perception and the creation of experiences that transcended normal sensory boundaries. This artistic philosophy led to the development of shadow magic techniques that prioritized emotional and psychological impact over practical utility. Practitioners learned to create shadow effects that could evoke specific emotional responses in viewers, manipulating darkness and light to generate feelings of awe, fear, tranquility, or exhilaration. These emotion-focused techniques required deep understanding of how shadow manipulation affected the viewer's consciousness, leading to insights that proved valuable for other applications of shadow magic as well. The study of emotional manipulation through shadow magic revealed unexpected connections between umbral techniques and the conventional schools of illusion and enchantment. Artists discovered that shadows infused with specific types of magical energy could influence viewers' thoughts and feelings in ways that persisted long after the initial exposure. These discoveries contributed to the development of hybrid techniques that combined shadow manipulation with conventional, magical approaches, creating new possibilities for both artistic expression and practical application. The influence of artistic shadow magic extended beyond the underground communities, where it was practiced to affect conventional magical research and education. Scholars who encountered examples of shadow art often found their understanding of magical theory challenged and expanded, leading to innovations in fields that had previously seemed unrelated to umbral manipulation. The mathematical frameworks developed by shadow artists for coordinating complex installations proved applicable to problems in conventional magical engineering, while their insights into perception and consciousness influenced developments in healing magic and divination. However, the artistic community's growing influence also attracted increased attention from authorities seeking to suppress shadow magic practice. The distinctive visual signatures of shadow art made it difficult to conceal from trained observers, and the large-scale installations favoured by some practitioners required resources and coordination that increased the risk of discovery. Several prominent artistic practitioners were captured during the Third Era purges that followed increased institutional surveillance of suspected shadow magic activity. The loss of these master artists represented a significant setback for shadow magic development, as they had possessed unique insights into the relationship between consciousness and umbral manipulation that had been gained through decades of experimental work. Their capture also led to the discovery of several major installations, which were subsequently destroyed by authorities despite their artistic and theoretical value. The surviving artistic practitioners adapted to increased persecution by developing more subtle and portable approaches to shadow art. They created techniques for producing shadow effects that could be activated and deactivated quickly, allowing artworks to appear as conventional objects when viewed by hostile observers. These adaptive artworks required extraordinary skill to create, but offered the security necessary for continued practice under hostile conditions. The development of portable shadow art led to the emergence of new forms of artistic expression that had no equivalent in conventional media. Shadow painters learned to create images that existed only in darkness, visible only when specific lighting conditions were met, and invisible under normal illumination. These dark paintings could be hidden in plain sight, appearing as blank canvases or simple decorative objects until the proper viewing conditions revealed their true content. Shadow musicians developed techniques for manipulating the acoustic properties of darkness itself, creating musical effects that seemed to emerge from empty space or that could only be heard in areas of deep shadow. These acoustic manipulations required understanding of how shadow magic affected sound transmission and perception, leading to innovations that influenced both artistic practice and practical applications of umbral techniques. The most innovative portable art form to emerge during this period was shadow literature, the creation of texts that could only be read under specific darkness conditions or that revealed different content when viewed in various lighting situations. Shadow authors learned to embed multiple layers of meaning within their works, creating stories that transformed completely depending on how they were illuminated during reading. These multi-layered texts served both artistic and practical purposes, as they provided effective methods for concealing shadow magic knowledge within seemingly innocent literary works. Authorities searching for forbidden magical texts would find only conventional stories or poetry, while trained practitioners could reveal the hidden technical information by applying proper shadow manipulation techniques during reading. The development of shadow literature represented a significant advance in information preservation and transmission for the shadow magic community. Unlike physical archives that could be discovered and destroyed, shadow texts could be hidden within conventional libraries and book collections, providing security that had been impossible to achieve through traditional methods. Master practitioners began encoding their most important discoveries within shadow literature, ensuring that crucial knowledge would survive, even if its creators were captured or killed. The techniques for creating shadow literature required combination of literary skill and advanced shadow magic knowledge, leading to collaboration between artists and theorists that proved beneficial for both groups. Writers gained access to magical techniques that enhanced their creative capabilities, while magical practitioners developed improved methods for organizing and presenting complex, theoretical information. These collaborations produced works that served as both artistic achievements and comprehensive textbooks for shadow magic theory and practice. The influence of shadow literature extended beyond the shadow magic community to affect conventional literary development throughout Tamriel. Writers who encountered examples of multi-layered shadow texts often incorporated similar techniques into their own work, creating conventional literature that revealed different meanings when read under various conditions or from different perspectives. These innovations enriched the literary culture of the time while providing additional cover for genuine shadow literature. The academic study of shadow literature by conventional scholars led to important discoveries about the relationship between written language and magical theory. Researchers found that the techniques used to embed multiple meanings within shadow texts revealed previously unknown principles governing how consciousness processed written information, leading to advances in fields ranging from education to magical communication. However, the growing sophistication of shadow literature also created new risks for the shadow magic community. The distinctive characteristics of multi-layered texts made them identifiable to trained observers, and authorities began developing techniques for detecting shadow literature within conventional collections. Several major discoveries of hidden knowledge occurred when investigators learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated the presence of shadow texts. The response to increased detection capabilities led to the development of even more sophisticated concealment techniques, with shadow authors creating texts that appeared completely conventional even under intensive magical examination. These ultra-concealed works required extraordinary skill to create and read, as they embedded shadow magic information within the natural variations in handwriting, paper texture, and ink composition that characterized any written document. The evolution of concealment techniques created an ongoing arms race between shadow magic practitioners and the authorities seeking to suppress them. Each new method of detection led to the development of improved concealment approaches, while each advance in concealment prompted the creation of more sophisticated detection techniques. This competitive dynamic drove rapid innovation in both shadow magic theory and conventional magical investigation methods. The intensity of this conflict during the late Second and early Third era led to the development of shadow magic techniques that bore little resemblance to the approaches used by earlier practitioners. The emphasis on concealment and survival had transformed shadow magic from a discipline focused on transcendent consciousness and expanded awareness into a collection of highly specialized techniques for operating covertly within hostile environments. This transformation created philosophical tensions within the shadow magic community between practitioners who maintained the traditional focus on consciousness expansion and those who viewed adaptation to persecution as the primary concern. The debate between these factions echoed the earlier conflict between Valdorous and Dralsy at Winterhold, but with the added urgency created by ongoing persecution and the constant threat of discovery. The traditionalist faction argued that abandoning the transcendent goals of shadow magic in favor of purely practical concerns represented a fundamental betrayal of the discipline's essential nature. They maintained that shadow magic's true value lay in its capacity to expand consciousness and provide access to deeper layers of reality, and that focusing exclusively on concealment and survival reduced it to merely another form of conventional magic, with no unique contribution to make. The adaptionist faction countered that survival was a prerequisite for any meaningful development of shadow magic theory, and that practitioners who ignored the realities of persecution would inevitably be discovered and eliminated. They argued that the techniques being developed for concealment and covert operation were themselves advancing understanding of shadow magic in important ways, revealing new applications and theoretical insights that would not have been discovered through traditional approaches. The resolution of this debate was ultimately determined by external circumstances rather than philosophical argument. The outbreak of the Oblivion Crisis in the Third Era created conditions that demanded immediate practical applications of shadow magic, while simultaneously providing opportunities for practitioners to emerge from hiding and contribute to the defense of Tamriel against Daedric invasion.